Hello, Bob Wells here, and welcome to another episode of the Undercurrent Stories podcast. Go to any airport and you will see passenger aircraft parked ready for their next trip. Airbus A319s, A320s, and then larger aircraft such as Boeing 777s, 787s, and A380s. Most people, when they travel, will use one of these aircraft. However, also in most airports, perhaps on your trip to the car park, you might have observed much smaller jets, usually parked in a discreet area away from the main terminals. These are the executive jets used by such people as celebrities, business executives, and government officials. But what are these jets actually like to travel in? Well, here to answer that question and many more, I'm joined by Nick Glover. Nick is a former executive jet captain with an extensive career in business aviation and is now an instructor at Aerobility, a charity which offers disabled people the opportunity to fly an aeroplane. Hello and welcome to the show, Nick.
Oh, good morning. Thanks very much, Bob.
Great to have you on. Before I start asking you some questions and we have a conversation, I was talking earlier on today to one of my former colleagues at work. He's actually got his pilot's license now.
Right.
And
yep.
I said to him, are there any questions that I could possibly ask Nick? And what he said to me was this, and I have no idea what this is, but he said, when you're coming in to land, do you bum fitch on downwind?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, everybody does. Yeah, it's basic and everybody does it. Yeah. So it's
what
just
is
a
that?
mnemonic it's a mnemonic which just makes sure that you've done all your, what we call the downwind checks or pre-landing checks. So you make sure the aircraft is configured for the landing before you start to fly the approach. So once you come onto base leg and then onto final approach, you've done the bump checks and so that you know the aircraft is properly configured. And it's a mantra that you do every single time. So, there's no danger of you forgetting. I mean, one of the main ones, of course, is that pilots forget to put the wheels down and then land wheels up. So as part of the bump check, it is that you check that the wheels are down as well as you're on the right fuel tank and, all the essential things are on that are going to keep you alive, really, basically.
Yes, I must admit there's always a sense of relief when you're on a passenger plane and you hear the wheels going down. It's always quite reassuring. Anyway, look, we got that out. Yeah, we got that out of the way. Thanks ever so much.
Right.
So before we talk about Aerobility and your life as an executive jet captain, could you just please tell us a bit about your life's journey and how you became interested in aviation?
Yes, it goes right back to a childhood, really. My father was one of 10 children, and he was thrown out of school at 14 by his father to say, right, go and get a job. You've got to contribute to the family finances. And they happened to live just around the corner from Croydon Airport. So in 1938, he became an engineering apprentice, and that's the start of his career in aviation. And, of course, then came the Second World War. And when he came back from the Second World War, he saw a poster which said, come and be aircrew, and it was about 19.06 a week, more than he was earning as an engineer. So he became a chief steward eventually and flew the world. And when you imagine it's just post-war, and my father was flying all around the world to lots of exotic places when we had austerity in Britain. So I suppose from a very young age, I was very aware of my father going and doing all this exciting stuff around the world. And the whole family was captured. We became an airline family. Both my brothers joined BOAC and British Airways, and even my mother. So the big difference really with me was that everybody was interested in the travel, but I was the only one in the family that was interested in the actual flying. It was the aeroplanes that fascinated me. And so from a very young age, there was nothing else in life I wanted to do, just to fly aeroplanes. So that was the very beginning.
And that Croydon Airport that you mentioned, was that the forerunner of Gatwick?
No, it was the forerunner of Heathrow, actually.
Was it?
Yeah, it was a grass airfield. So it was the main London airport at the time. And the aeroplanes that used it, went right round the world. The HP-42s down to South Africa, down to Australia, right through the Far East. But the problem was that as aeroplanes got bigger and faster, they needed tarmac runways, and Croydon was just within too much of a built-up area of London, so they needed more space. And it was quite fortuitous that in 1944 the government decided they suddenly needed a massive, great bomber airfield. And then not long after that, the war ended, and they had this ready-built airport in open land, and they thought, what should we do with it? Let's make it London's airport. And that's how Heathrow was born.
Oh, so Heathrow was formerly a bomber command airport.
Yeah, exactly. The war was ending, and they knew that they were going to need a big airport. So I think in wartime, it's easy to commandeer the land, isn't it? Whereas they probably would have had loads of public inquiries afterwards, and so it was quite fortuitous from the government's point of view. So, of course, my father then moved to Heathrow, or what was then called London Airport, and started flying on Lancastrian bombers but all manner of aircraft, including the Comet 1. Actually, my father was on the Comet 1 for a period until they grounded them all. But as we grew up, of course, I grew up right next to the airport and just was amongst aeroplanes all the time. And in those days, there was no security, so I could, as a young teenager, I could pedal round to the hangars at Heathrow Airport, park my bike, and wander through the hangars, wander on and off airplanes. Nobody ever challenged me. So it was absolute freedom. It was brilliant.
I lived in Windsor, and one of the hobbies that a lot of kids had at the schools was to go plane spotting. And the big trip, you'd cycle to Heathrow Airport, you'd go to the top of a multi-storey car park, get your binoculars out, get your CAM, civil aviation markings book, and sign them off. And if you had more money, you went to the Queen's Building. I don't know whether people still do that there.
No, the Queen's Building shut down many years ago, but it was about £2 bob, I think, wasn't it, to go up onto the roof gardens. Yeah. But the spotters still go to the car park, onto the roof of the car park. That still happens now.
Yeah.
So, yes, it's a very popular pastime. I never really was much of a spotter, but I just had this eye that I really wanted to fly. So the two problems I had as a youngster was, I was pretty lazy academically. I subscribed to the philosophy of just enough, so I did just enough to get by. But I was also chronically shy as a teenager. I mean, the idea of asking a girl out was, terrible for me. And so they're not really attributes that are conducive to being a good pilot, really. But come the right time, I mean, I got just enough GCEs to sort of go into flying schools. And I did go for the interviews. And I was this shy young chap surrounded by these absolute gods who were so full of confidence, and I basically didn't stand a chance. I mean, they were accepting, I think, about 1 every 200 applicants for training, and about 20% of those were chopped during the course as well. So it was quite disheartening for a while. So I was left a bit of adrift, thinking, well, I've got to be involved with aeroplanes. So as I left school, the nearest area of the airport where I lived was the cargo department. So I got a job with a cargo agent, which was on the ramp. It was right by the airplane. So I learned how to import goods through the cargo department. And after a couple of years, then jobs came up within BOAC, which was the forerunner to British Airways. So I got a job at Victoria in central London in the telephone sales department, selling tickets, which, although it wasn't near the aeroplanes, it was still involved, and I learnt the computer systems, and it was quite an exciting place to be. You're dealing with people travelling the world. But eventually, after a couple of years there, we then became, from BOAC, we combined with BEA and became British Airways. So that widened up the possibility for other jobs. And I managed to get a job in the flight ops department in the Queen's Building, actually at Heathrow. So I was getting closer and closer to where I wanted to be. So
you hadn't given up the idea of flying?
I had, yeah. I really thought I'm just going to have a ground job, and I really didn't think I'd be able to get into flying. But after a couple of years in flight ops, I saw an advert for a job which was the Executive Aircraft Service Department, a department of British Airways, but it was dedicated just to looking after private and VIP flights and doing all manner of the ground handling. So I applied for that, and by some miracle, I got the job. And that was the making of me, really. I mean, if there was a ground job made for me, it was that. And I learned all aspects of, not from just passenger handling, greeting and meeting the passengers, but flight planning, I could file a flight plan, I could do the weather briefings, all the stuff that the pilots did, we provided as a ground handling service. Loading the bags, organising, refuelling, absolutely every aspect of the operation. So it was pretty exciting stuff, and I absolutely loved it. But it was during that period, one of the colleagues I worked with actually had a PPL, a private pilot's licence, which he'd got through the British Airways Flying Club. So I thought, right, well, there's no reason why I shouldn't do that. At least I would know what it's like to fly an aeroplane. Yes. So I gathered my pennies, because I imagine by this time I had a house, 2 kids, a mortgage. So to give up the time to learn to fly, I mean, I have to say my wife was very understanding, and
she believed in you.
She knew it. Well, she knew it was my dream, so she indulged me with it. And I went and did the first few lessons. I mean, initially I could only afford to do 1 flying lesson a month, which is not conducive to good continuity. So it took me a couple of years to get my private license.
How did you feel when you first? I'm assuming that had you been up in cockpits and flown with pilots prior to this, or was it a brand new experience? You had.
No, not at all. I mean, when I was in flight ops, I used to wangle trips on the flight deck, so on Tridents, 111s, that sort of aeroplane, TriStars. I would hop on the flight deck on a flight deck pass and go to Athens or Paris or just to ride on the flight deck, and because I got quite friendly with quite a lot of the regular BA pilots then. And when I went to the executive aircraft department, a lot of aircraft would come into Heathrow, drop passengers off, and then go empty, back to their base or somewhere else in Europe. And it's literally a question of saying to the pilot, can I hop on and come with you, get a ride somewhere? We used to have staff travel tickets to get a standby flight to come home again. So I did that all the time, just for the fun of it and to gain the experience of it.
Tell us about your first lesson.
My first lesson, gosh, I thought I'm never going to cope with this. It was noisy. The concentration involved was so intense that it was about 40 minutes, my first lesson. And I did fly an approach, but the instructor did the actual landing. And I walked away from that lesson absolutely exhausted. And I thought, I'm never going to cope with this. How am I ever going to cope with flying an aeroplane? But of course, it's like anything new you're learning.
Yeah,
you go with it, and it becomes more familiar. So but that I do remember that as my first experience, that total exhaustion, but also at the same time total exhilaration. It was absolutely fantastic. I'd say it's the best thing I'd ever done up to that point.
And what type of aircraft was it that you flew?
That was a 2-seat Piper Tomahawk aircraft, and it was a well-known training aeroplane. So it was the favoured training aircraft for the British Airways Flying Club at the time. Yeah, but the big change came when it came towards my actual, what they called then, the general flying test. To get my private pilot's licence, the chief flying instructor and the chief examiner at the BA Flying Club was a regular British Airways pilot called Tim Orchard, and I developed a pretty good friendship with him over the couple of years that I was learning, and he actually did my test for me, and he was very complimentary at the end of the test, and so he said, you have the aptitude, you could go the whole way and get your airline transport pilot's license. So that was my first inkling that I could actually follow the dream. It was a long road, tough.
So how long did it take from that very first lesson to
from the very first lesson to me getting
commercial pilot?
Yeah, to getting full commercial. It took me just under 10 years.
10 years.
So
wow.
And bearing in mind I'd started when I was early 30s, so
yes.
It was in my early 40s by the time I qualified. And it was, you can't do it these days. It's a different system. In those days, it was called the self-improver route. And in order to sit the initial exams for the commercial license, you had to log 700 flying hours. Now, you can imagine the expense and the time that takes, especially doing a full-time job at the same time. So I had to get to that 700 hours before I could then sit the initial commercial pilot's tests, written tests. So that took, several years. I can't remember how many, but.
And you say they don't do that formal training now. I guess it's probably more in one go, is it?
It's modular nowadays. So really, actually, you can walk in with no flying experience now. You do all the modules and you do the one set of exams for the airline transport pilot's license.
Yeah.
And then it's about 250 hours of training to get you up to instrument rating. So that then you could go straight onto an airliner with 250 hours within less than 18 months of starting from scratch. So it's a totally different regime now. And I suppose you get people coming straight out of school and straight into that module, and that's where the pilot market comes from nowadays. But in my day, there were plenty of us doing the self-improver route, and one of the biggest challenges initially was to build that 700 hours. But I was always up for looking for cheap ways of flying, even try to get free flying if I could. And two things happened, actually, which were massive boosts for me. Tim Orchard not only was the chief flying instructor, but he was also corporate pilot to Lord King and the board of directors. They operated a Beech 300 King Air, a twin-engined propeller aircraft, which they used to fly the board of directors around Europe quite a lot. And it was legally it was a single pilot operation. But Lord King announced to Tim that he really wanted two pilots on board, mainly somebody to put the wheels up and down and serve him his whiskey during the flight, which Tim then invited me to do. But it did involve flying. It involved flying the aeroplane. And so I did about half of my multi-engine rating was done by Tim training me on Lord King's King Air at British Airways expense. So a great way of saving some money and advancing. But the other really big thing that happened was that I was reading the back of Pilot magazine one day in the small ads, and there was a very tiny personal ad, and it said, "Come to Chicago, fly our Cessna 152 for $20 an hour, including the fuel, free accommodation and free pickup from the airport." And when I read that, I thought, this has got to be a scam. But I thought I could get a free ticket to get over to Chicago. So I thought I'll go over there for a few days and see what the scam is, and at least then I'll know. When I got there, it was exactly as advertised. They picked me up, took me to this lovely grass airfield in the middle of Wisconsin, and off I went flying as much as I wanted. At the end of the week, sure enough, $20 an hour. And I went to the boss. The boss was actually a retired TWA captain, and he was basically an aviation nut who just wanted to spread the joy of aviation around the world. So that's why he put these ads in magazines all around the world. So I said to him, well, look, your people are going to think it's a scam. So if you get inquiries from the UK, I'm very happy if you give my phone number and I'll tell people exactly what I think of the place. So he did that. And when I got home, my phone just rang off the hook. I mean, I was getting 20 phone calls a day from people wanting to know about it. And it helped to put so much business his way. I got pretty friendly with Bud because I was going over there at least twice a month to build my hours. And sometimes I'd go to him at the end of the week and he'd say, "All right, this week's on the house," and he wouldn't charge me. So, it was another big boost, to me, building my hours and getting on. So, that was it. And I eventually, I suppose, cutting a fairly long story short, I got all my training done. I got all my exams done. And at the time that I was ready to move on, there was a company based at Farnborough flying. They had a total of 7 jet airplanes. And again, I'd got very friendly with the boss of that company over the years because we looked after them at Heathrow. And he had loosely offered me a job in the past. But once I went to him and said, "Right, I've got my license now, fully qualified, give me a job," he said, "Okay." And as luck would have it, British Airways were offering severance packages to offload staff. So I got a severance package which covered a lot of the costs of my training, and then had the weekend off, and then started at Farnborough straight off. I'm flying around Europe, and I flew Citation aircraft, which are little small twin jet aeroplanes, and the fantastic British-built aeroplane, the HS-125, which had a bit of a longer range and a bigger cabin and a proper inside toilet. So a lovely aeroplane to fly.
Did you ever want to fly larger commercial aircraft?
Not really, no.
It was just the way the path took you, I guess.
Well, that's right. Having worked in the executive aircraft department and worked with small aircraft. I say small aircraft. I mean, some of the executive aircraft were airliners, but I got into that mindset where I loved the excitement of the phone going and saying, right, get to the airfield, you're going to Paris or you're going to Rome. That buzz, you don't get that as an airline pilot. You get your monthly roster and you go and fly your rostered flights. I mean, I compare it really to being the bus driver as opposed to a limousine driver, where everything is ad hoc. So, I just loved that buzz. My wife could always tell if I had been called out for a trip because she could hear me whistling while I was packing my bag upstairs, Yeah. And I think she was actually convinced that I didn't really have a job. She said she thought I just got paid to go on holiday all the time.
Yeah, it sounds good to me. And I have to say, most of us, sadly, will never have the opportunity of going on one of those jets. Tell us a little bit about the exclusive side of aviation, Nick, if you can.
Well, it's the people that we deal with, really. I mean, such a wide variety of people. And the beauty of it is that you actually get to see well-known, famous people that you see on the films and on the television every day, from royalty to government ministers to film stars and pop stars, and you get to see them one-to-one, not for a very long time, but you really get to see what people are really like, and I quite like that aspect of it. And especially in those days when, I mean, on a regular basis, I would say have a 15-minute car ride with, Nelson Mandela or Henry Kissinger, world figures. And I get 15 minutes to chat to them, one-to-one. But it might be, a pop star. Frank Bruno was great. I mean, I spent 20 minutes with Frank Bruno. What a lovely man he was. And seeing that aspect of people, you do see a downside. You see the ones that are actually full of themselves and, they really think they're something special and talk down to people. But I tend to not worry about them so much. I mean, I like to, if I'm talking about that side of the job, I like to be upbeat. And, the occasions that I flew, I mean, we had the contract to fly the royal family, for example. So flying people like, who was then Prince Charles or Princess Anne, and ultimately the Queen, it was complete joy. And it was, I would say, the ultimate for my whole flying career, really. I mean, you don't get better than flying the Queen, you have to say.
No. And having that time with these people must, as you say, it's quite a privilege, really, isn't it?
It is, yeah. You do get some quite amusing things. I was made redundant, actually. The first company I flew with, after 3 years, they went bust. So I was suddenly thrown out of work. And I didn't have an awful lot of flying hours. And there was quite a lot of competition for jobs. So I was a bit stuck for a while. And I went back to Heathrow, to the department where I was doing the ground handling for the VIP flights. And I mean, I had a really quite a funny experience once when I had to go and pick up Gordon Brown from a flight and drive him to the VIP suite. And as he got in my car, he said, I've got to get to a telephone. I've had a message to say number 10 needs to speak to me urgently. So I said, well, we're about a 10-minute drive away from the suite. So I said, there are no telephones. He said, no, it's urgent. So I said, well, the only phone I have, you're very welcome. You can borrow my mobile phone. So I handed it to him. Now, at that moment, I was between jobs and I was waiting for a phone call from the chief pilot of a company who was going to invite me for interview. So it was quite a critical phone call. Yeah. Anyway, Gordon Brown was on the phone and he was chatting away to somebody at number 10. And then he said to me, oh, they need to check some figures and ring me back. He said, what's the number? I said, oh, they'll have it because you've rung them. So just tell them to ring that number. So we were sitting there, stony. I have to tell you, Gordon Brown's not a chatter. We were sitting there, stony silence. And after a few minutes, the phone rang and he answered it. And he handed the phone to me and he said, it's for you. And it was the chief pilot of this company to arrange my interview. And he then said to me, who's that answering your mobile phone? And when I said, oh, that was Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he thought I was being, flippant. And I came that close to not getting the job, I mean, I have a fund of stories like that, with funny things that happened, particularly with, different celebrities. But it was just great fun. It was a good, enjoyable way of earning a living.
I was talking to our mutual friend Tim Clare, who introduced
Oh,
the two of us. And he mentioned about the when you met Jimmy Carter. Could you tell listeners a bit about that, please, Nick?
Oh, yes. Okay. I'll make it fairly brief. But yes, that was again ground handling. It was when Jimmy Carter had just ceased to be the president, and he became this envoy for the UN with special interest in developing countries, particularly countries like Ethiopia and Somalia. He spent a lot of time on fact-finding trips, and he'd been lent a private Boeing 727 from a Middle Eastern bank to fly down to the Middle East. But I was dispatching the flight at Heathrow, and talking to the captain, we noticed that one of the tyres had a flat spot where on landing it hadn't spun up properly, and it had just burnt the rubber straight down to the canvas. And the captain said to me, well, there's no way we can go down to Ethiopia with the aeroplane in this state. He said, and I haven't got a spare. He said, can you come up with a spare? So shot back to the office, ringing round all the maintenance units. And it was in the days when 727s as airliners were phasing out and the Airbuses were coming online. There weren't many people operating 727s. But so we were going to have to ship a spare wheel in from the US, which was going to take 24 hours. But one of my colleagues gave a whoop, and he was talking to the Air France maintenance manager, who said, yes, I do have a wheel assembly in my store. And he said, oh, great, can we have it? And the chap said, nope. And I said, well, why not? You're not even operating 727s in, and we can replace it within 24 hours. But this chap was absolutely adamant, no way could we have this wheel. So in the meantime, of course, the passengers were turning up at the VIP lounge expecting to go on a flight. So I was dispatched round there to break the news to the actual VIP people, whose job it was then to go in and liaise with him. But of course, the thing about these VIP people is they don't like dealing with bad news. They're great at meeting and greeting. But so after I'd explained the situation, they said to me, well, you know the score. You'd better come in and tell him. So I was wheeled in to see the great man. And bearing in mind at the time, he had a very, very high profile. He'd only just been president of the US. So, he was as famous as Donald Trump is now. And and as soon as he saw me, he knew there was a problem. So I walked over to him. And I'm a great believer, if there's bad news, don't pussyfoot around it, give it straight. So I told him exactly the problem. And I said, there is a wheel on the airfield, but the manager won't release it. So we're going to have to fly one in, and it is going to be a 24-hour delay. And he just listened quietly, didn't say anything. And he put down his coffee cup and he just said to me, so where's the man with the wheel? So I said, oh, he's in an office not very far away. So he said, well, will you take me to him? And with his very southern drawl. So, yeah, of course. So he came out. He got into his Lincoln Continental limousine with the flags at the front and police outriders. I was in my little British Airways car. And we drove round the airside buildings, around the back of the Queen's Building and Terminal 2, and pulled up outside the maintenance office. Now, the interesting thing, to get to talk to the manager, he worked in a little office. But it was at the end of the restroom that was used by all the loading staff, all the ramp staff, the engineers and the baggage loaders and that sort of thing. So to get to speak to him, we had to walk into the restroom. So it was just Jimmy and myself. We walked into the restroom, and it really was like John Wayne walking into the saloon. The whole place just went really quiet. And we had to walk the whole length of this restroom to get to the manager, who he spoke to the men through a little grill, like a post office type grill. So he could see us coming. And Jimmy, he slowly walked the whole length of this building. And the poor manager, his eyes were getting like saucers, as we came. And it just got to the grill, and he leant down and he said, are you the man with the wheel? And the guy just nodded. He said, can I have it? And the guy nodded again. And he just said, thank you very much. And we just turned around and walked back out. And he had a biggest grin on his face. I mean, he obviously really enjoyed the fun of that.
That's fantastic.
And I've never met that manager since then. I don't know what he thought about the whole thing. But, within an hour and a half, the aircraft was mended and off they went on their trip. I would say that's probably about the most surreal experience I ever had
Yeah,
working at
I
Heathrow.
bet. I bet. Absolutely. Yeah, but it sounds like you've enjoyed the job for the people and the sort of amazing stories that you've got, and you must have many more. Have you got any stories about any rock stars at all?
Well, I have. One of the funny things I find about that, though, is that there's this modern idea that using private jets is not, sort of the modern way. So, I mean, the two main, I suppose,
Do you mean from an environmental point of view?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of frowned upon almost now, isn't it? You hear about all this talk about Prince Harry whizzing around on private jets, and it's like meant in a kind of a derogatory way. So I've always held a sort of certain amount of discretion. The only thing I would say is that the two main bands that we used to operate for were one was Elton John, and the other was the Paul McCartney band. But in order to answer that question about private jets, is that the sorts of tours that they did to get around to the countries that they did and to reach the audiences that they did, there's no way you could do it without using a private jet. So, there is a place in the world for them. But the great thing was that the bands would come off stage and they late at night, they'd come straight out to the airport onto the aircraft and it would be party time. I mean, these people, they've been doing this performing for years and years and years, but they still get that same buzz even now. And the nice thing about it is that as a crew, we were included in that, in that good feeling. So especially when we landed, sometimes, they want to carry on partying on the aeroplane, which they did sometimes. So it was good fun. And you sometimes, I had a funny experience once when. With a pretty massive rock star was actually waiting for the immigration people to come on board the aeroplane. So we had to just hang around and wait for a bit. And the keyboard player had his wife, who'd been a backing singer for him. And I went back into the cabin to chat with them while we were waiting. And it was almost like a case of reverse celebrity. This lady, who was a very attractive lady, she was very impressed that the captain had come back to be with the passengers. So I was almost like taking on that celebrity role. And here I was with these, super duper international rock stars. So it was quite a funny experience, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, good fun.
You're the captain. You're flying the plane. Do you have in these smaller planes? Do you have a co-pilot?
Oh yeah, always two crew. Yeah. And in fact, in a way, they run like in the same way as the airliners. The licensing is the same. To fly, the best aeroplane I ever flew was the Falcon 900, a French-built, Dassault-built aircraft. And, and again, it was about a 5-week training course, including simulator, so done exactly the same way as airliners would be. So there isn't, when you're public transport, so you're actually charging people money to fly them, then the licensing is exactly the same as for the airliners.
You'd have two pilots, and then you'd have stewardesses as well, would you?
Yeah, we usually carried a stewardess, and occasionally we'd have two stewardesses on board, but usually it was just one.
We see pictures of the insides of these things on programs like Succession and things like that, and for the passengers themselves, I mean, presumably it's a very comfortable flight, beds and everything.
Absolutely, yeah. We have beds. We have really nice toilet facilities. Have a galley where really the sorts of food that our cabin crew would produce out of these galleys, and very often it's scratch done. I mean, a lot of my time on a night stop would be being dragged off to a delicatessen by the stewardess to get next day's catering. So. I mean, in a way, if you compare executive flying to being an airline pilot. An airline pilot, I suppose he turns up at the airport, does his briefing, gets on the aircraft and flies the aeroplane. The most contact he has with the passengers is when he does the PA. When you're an executive jet pilot, you do the whole lot. I'll load the passengers' bags on, possibly. I'll have arranged the refueling. I'll have arranged the crew's hotel accommodation. If the passenger says to me, "Oh, I haven't arranged a car," when I get to the other end when we land, it's me that
You'll do that as well. Yeah.
I'll do that absolutely, and we cover every aspect of it. And when the passengers are gone, the cabin crew and the pilots, they go into the cabin, tidy up the cabin, clean up, vacuum the carpet.
Oh, right.
It's a whole immersion in every aspect of the operation. Supervising the toilets and everything.
And in terms of actually flying the aircraft, compared with a larger plane, like I don't know, in those days, I suppose jumbos and things like that. Could you switch to fly a 747? Could a 747 pilot come and switch? Could they switch to come fly one of your planes?
Absolutely.
They're very similar.
There isn't. The principles are the same. Put it that way.
Yeah.
The main thing with an executive jet is that the payload is usually a lot less. Airliners, they load the airplane up to its maximum payload for most trips. I mean, that's where the airlines are going to make their money. With an executive jet, in a 12-seat airplane, you might only have 2 passengers with not very much baggage. And if you're not going very far, you haven't got an awful lot of fuel. So you can imagine the excess power you have in the aircraft. I mean, one of my favourite things would be in the Falcon. We've got 3 engines at the back, each producing 5,000 pounds of thrust. If you haven't got many passengers on board and not much fuel, and air traffic then says, we're giving you a 10,000-foot climb. Can you give me a good rate of climb? You can put full power on, put the nose straight up and go straight upwards, and gain 5,000-6,000 feet a minute. And the fun of doing that.
Yeah.
And if you go into it smoothly, you don't feel it. The passengers don't feel any G at all. You've got to do it smoothly. But the performance of the airplane, you can actually have a lot more fun with it than generally you can with an airliner.
I don't know whether it's the same for executive jets, but why do aircraft always seem to fly at 39,000 feet?
Well, the higher you go, the more efficient the engines are, so you burn less fuel. So, and of course, I mean, our aircraft, the Falcon, was actually certified up to 51,000 feet. Although in practice you couldn't ever really get up that high because you'd never be light enough to do it. But the highest I ever went was 49,000 feet in a Falcon. But the higher you go, the more efficient the engines, because it's a fuel-air mixture. So with less air going through the engines, you've got less fuel going through. So you extend the range and burn less fuel. So it's just a...
What's a typical range of something like the Falcon that you mentioned there?
Oh, it was a perfect for me because the modern aircraft you get now, like Gulfstreams, I mean, they'll fly for 14, 15 hours sometimes. And, I never want to fly that sort of length. But the longest flight I ever did in the Falcon was 9.5 hours. We went from Geneva to Boston. And that's perfect. I mean, 9 hours in an airplane, you get off, go to a hotel. It's a very civilised way of working and cuts down on the fatigue.
You mentioned earlier on the guy at the club said that you could go all the way. You had the makings of a very good pilot. What do you think? What are the personality traits, say, of an executive jet pilot compared with a passenger jet pilot? What attributes do you have to have?
Right. Okay. I think what it comes down to is your outlook, I think, on life. And I always had a philosophy of being nice to everybody I met for a start, but being proactive, being positive about what could possibly be done. And it did stand me in very good stead. I think when you go for a job and you're being interviewed, if you have the license, it's probably accepted as a given that you can actually fly the airplane. So from that point of view, they accept that you can do the job. But if you're being interviewed by a chief pilot for an operation, in the interview, he's thinking, I could be away for 3 weeks with this chap, seeing him all day, every day. Would I want to spend that time in this chap's company? And it's the way that you share the job, share the duties. So if you work as a team and you're proactive with everybody and you've got a good stewardess or good cabin crew, that you all work well together, that's the kind of qualities they're looking for. And that translates onto the passengers as well. Because if the crew are working well together, when you greet the passengers, I mean, our passengers, we didn't have a flight deck door. Our passengers are always very welcome to come up to the flight deck and say hello and sit and have a chat during the cruise and that sort of thing. And so at the end of the trip, when the passenger gets off and shakes the captain's hand and says, "Thank you, Captain, that was a great flight," you know that you've personally had a hand in doing that. Whereas I suppose if you're an airliner, it's just a numbers game in lots of ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a very personal thing towards the crew and towards the passengers, and also towards the ground handlers. If you get somewhere, land somewhere, and the ground handler is under pressure and he's got problems, if you shout and stamp your foot, and I find you get nowhere. But if you get that person on your side, and so you're nice to him and encouraging, he then wants to help you, and I find cooperation. It works very, very well. Yeah, in general terms.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about airability, but before I do that, if we've got any listeners who are thinking, maybe considering a life in aviation as a pilot, have you got any advice that you'd be able to give them, please, Nick?
Yeah, definitely. No experience is wasted. So if you get a job loading bags, for example, you're at the airplane, you're learning the basics of aviation safety, being on the ramp around an airplane. So take on any job to get experience. Also, as I was saying just now, be proactive, and be positive and actually pleasant to people that you're working with. And the other thing is that if it's your dream, like it was mine, to go the whole way and get your license, don't be discouraged. There are loads of setbacks. There are loads of problems. But you have to really want it, and don't be put off by setbacks. Just plough through it and go for the next thing. And the final thing I'd say, some of the people I trained with had this goal in their mind, and they were focused and head down and working, studying hard to get their goal. So they didn't enjoy the journey. I have to say, quite honestly, I enjoyed every aspect of the training, of the hour building I did. I didn't think beyond the moment. I just didn't think beyond the next bit of flying or the next test I had to do. And so I enjoyed the journey. And that's all I'd say, is enjoy the journey.
That's quite a good philosophy on life as well, isn't it, really? Enjoying the journey rather than just waiting to get to the destination.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I'm now retired from flying, but I still get involved in loads of other stuff, including Aerobility, and enjoy it. I enjoy it. People sometimes say to me, "Oh, don't I miss the jet flying?" And I think, well, yeah, of course, but I look back fondly on it, and I don't think of it. I don't hanker back for it. I just think of it as a fond memory, and then I think, "Oh, right, I'm at Aerobility," and move on and do that and enjoy that just as much.
So just before we talk about what you do at Aerobility, I know it's a charity. Could you just tell us a little bit about Aerobility, please?
Yes, it started. The main chap that was the main driver of it is a chap called Mike Miller-Smith, who was a pilot, and he was going to become a commercial pilot, and he ended up getting quite a bad muscle wasting disease, and so he was never going to fly again. But he didn't lose that dream of wanting to fly, and thought, really, just because somebody's disabled, why should they be excluded from something which is such a great pleasure? And so that was the inspiration for getting Aerobility off the ground. And it's a philosophy we follow through now. The main thing is, if you get somebody in an aeroplane who's severely disabled and they can fly an aircraft, their mindset then becomes, well, if I can fly an airplane, what else can I do? So that ability to control an aircraft has an effect on actually the whole of their life then.
Yes. They're trained to get their license, are they?
So, very often, yeah. In fact, over the last few years, most of the time, I've actually retired from instructing now, but I still sort of do teaching and volunteering at Aerobility. But over the years that I was teaching, instructing, many of the students we had were military people that had been injured, in Afghanistan or Iraq. So you can imagine a fit young guy who's, in the army, gets really badly injured, loses his legs or something like that, goes rock bottom, goes right back up from being rock bottom to rebuilding their life. We then get them at Aerobility, stick them in an aeroplane, and all of a sudden they've got another positive outlook on life. And very, very many of the people like that, we would get back, and they've got their licenses. Even wheelchair users, they can wheel their wheelchair up to the airplane, hop on the wing, dismantle the wheelchair, load it in the airplane, and off they go.
So the idea of the charity is to build people's positivity and build their esteem again, build their confidence. And also, if they want to, they can learn how to fly, but also sometimes just go for a joyride.
Absolutely that, yeah. Or we get groups of youngsters, say, for example, with a particular disability, whether it's autism or, a physical disability or something like that. And we'll get a group of them and we'll give them each a flying experience, give them a chance to fly the aeroplane. And again, it's like a party atmosphere, and people talk about it. We get feedback from parents, particularly. They say it changes their child's whole attitude to life, and it changes the way they engage at school. It's amazing the effect it has on people's outlook and confidence.
And where is it based?
We're based at Blackbush, but we're kind of branching out a bit now. We did a big flying weekend recently down in Newquay in Cornwall. We're setting up a satellite base at Lydd, so we've got some instructors there that can, and we've got another one up at a place called Taton Hill up in the Midlands. So but the main base is Blackbush, but we are kind of spreading our wings a bit, as it were.
Lydd is in Kent, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
I did a parachute jump at Lydd many years ago.
Oh, did you?
Out of a what was it? A Cessna. Yeah, I was number one. Right. I got out first, but I remember Lydd, and I remember it because when you got out at 2,000 feet, you just looked like a cigarette packet on the ground, and you had to get down there.
Absolutely.
And they said to us, make sure you get. I said, do you need to land on the cross? They said, no, don't worry about it. Just get on the airfield, because next door there was a safari park.
Yeah. Oh, right. So, yes, you wouldn't want to land amongst the lions. Yeah.
No.
I know.
We digress.
We did I did a parachute jump last year, actually, with my son. I think it made me laugh, actually. Because,
was it a tandem jump, or was it on your own?
It was a tandem skydive. And I said to him, look, come and do this jump with me. And in a weak moment, he said yes, and immediately regretted it. But we jumped together. And after we'd landed, I said to him, are you glad you did that? He said, yes, I'm glad I did it. He said, but I will never, ever do it again.
No, once was enough for me. It was before the days of tandem jumps, and it was just myself on my own. But it was something I'd always wanted to do. Right. I think I remember watching John Noakes on Blue Peter doing it, so I thought, I can doing that. So where can people? Well, two questions really. How is Aerobility funded, and where can people find out more about it?
Right. Well, there's an awful lot of corporate funding. So we're funded by companies like Boeing, for example, and the National Air Traffic Service are a big funders. They provide funds, but also we're looked after by the Royal Air Force and particularly the Red Arrows. The Red Arrows took us under their wing quite some years ago, so they do a lot of publicity stuff for us. But of course there's private funding. I give talks about my aviation life, and whoever I give talks to, they say, well, what's your fee? And I say, well, there's no fee, but make a donation to Aerobility. So it's any amount. And of course, when people come off the street, even though it's a charity, if somebody wants to learn to fly, they then pay, but it is subsidised as a charity, so it's a reduced rate. Yeah. So there's a fairly good, strong income stream. And we have an annual ball every November, which is probably the biggest single fundraiser for the charity.
Yes. Well, Nick, this has been a really interesting conversation. It's been so good to learn more about executive jet travel, and I loved hearing some of those stories. I think there's a book there somewhere, don't you? Also, good to hear about the work that you do with Aerobility, such a great charity, and how it provides those opportunities for disabled people is absolutely fantastic. My guest today has been Nick Glover. Nick is a former executive jet captain and instructor at Aerobility. Thank you for coming on the show, Nick.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.